Leopold Romberg today. He lives at 3030 McKinney at Latour, at the beautiful Latour. My name is Nancy Ungerman. I will be interviewing him, and Ruth Andrus is the videographer. Hello.
Hello. Welcome to our place.
Thanks. Thank you. It's good to be here. I'm going to start with where you were born and just tell me about your early childhood before you came to the United States.
I was born in a little town called Astheim, A-S-T-H-E-I-M, Germany. It's in the armpit of where the Rhine River meets the Main River. It's in the Frankfurt district. In 1930, I was the second child. I have an older sister. She's a year older than I. She also lives here in Dallas. Astheim was a small farming community where our grandfather settled, our maternal grandfather settled there, became what we think was a fairly prosperous general store, farm and ranch type operation, and financier or cattle dealer for the farming community around there. He died in 29. He left a fairly prosperous business that my mother inherited. My mother was the third of 4 children. The other 3 all married and left that little town. She stayed behind, and partly to take care of her parents, and also her husband. They married in 36, and he moved to this little town. He was a World War I veteran from the Kaiser's army. He was an unusual veteran because he was Jewish, and he actually had a commission. He was an officer in the Kaiser's army, which for a Jew was a rarity.
I was going to ask, there weren't many Jews in World War I?
There were many Jews who fought for Germany, but very few. He may have been one of the only ones that became an officer. And we heard that this was such a rarity from family that we met later on. Unfortunately, he was severely war wounded, and he died when he was 44, when I was 4. He died in 34. So he and my mom had a very short life together. Anyway, I was born in 30. The Nazis came to power in 33. And immediately our life there in this little town became really intolerable. We were one of 2 Jewish families in that town. The other family were called Strausses. Our family was Rothschild Romberg. Our name was Romberg, but our maternal lineage was Rothschild. In very short order, a local Nazi club was founded there. One very rabid anti-Semitic leader took full charge of the anti-Semitic line of the Nazi Party, began to harass my mom, who had plenty on her hands with this big business.
What was the business?
We had a general store and a grain trading business. And actually, I believe my grandfather actually financed a lot of the farmers, and when he helped them bring either their grain and their cattle to market, and then when they marketed, he got paid back. The big problem ensued from that was that when the Nazis came in, they either directed or persuaded the local farmers not to honor their bills, their debts to Jews. And in a very short time, this business became unmanageable for our mother. And in 1936, or early 37, she decided that this little place was no place to stay. It was just too difficult for her. The business was no longer feasible. She had to take care of her mother, my grandmother, and this very, very large house. In any event, her next oldest sibling, my aunt, her sister, had moved to a larger community called Eschwege in central Germany. And she decided to move there in the hope that there was a larger Jewish community and that anti-Semitism wouldn't be as severe. It probably wasn't in 36, but it quickly thereafter became that way.
So you hung around for 3 years, from
Yeah,
33
and
to
then we went,
36.
then in 30, I think it was in 36, we moved to this other town where my sister and I enrolled in school. By then already, Jews were no longer welcome in the general school population, so we enrolled in the Jewish school. The Jews had to form a school, so there was a Jewish day school next to the synagogue, and we enrolled there. And that went on, yeah, and my sister, I think, was a year older than I, but I was in effect, it was probably kindergarten, but I'm no longer sure of that. Anyway, came Kristallnacht, which was 37. The synagogue was gutted. The school was closed. The teacher was told, under pain of threat of death, he would not teach Jewish kids anymore. And the Jewish community quickly disintegrated. People tried to get out, many did. A lot of course didn't. Some of my friends that I remember didn't. My sister remembers a good bit more. But we stayed there until 39. In 39, things became really, really desperate. And as good fortune would have it, my mother's cousin, a cousin of my mother's, had left for England several years, and I'm not sure how long they were there, but they were residents in England, in London, and had a fairly prosperous business. Started a cigarette lighter business called Colibri, which became an internationally known brand in England, and vouched or arranged for a visa for my mom. The visa, and I can give you kind of a copy of it, which you can take, but I will need them back. I'll give you some documents.
Thank you.
And she heard about Kindertransport. And I don't know how she did it, but we got on Kindertransport, and she got on with this visa to England on the same boat. So she, in effect, was a chaperone, and different from the other chaperones because she then had a British visa. She was not forced to go back to Germany. But she was, part of the condition of her visa to go to England was that she signed something that said she would take no other job than domestic help, because that was the English were the first of the trade unionists, and the British didn't want foreigners taking their jobs. But they didn't mind foreigners cleaning their toilets. So Mom became a housemaid. And of course she couldn't afford to keep us. So we, through the British equivalent of what was at that time the equivalent of Hayes here, was an organization in England called Bloomsbury House. And Bloomsbury House arranged to have us fostered out on English families, where possible on Jewish families, where not possible on any family that would take us. So we got shipped to a town that you will probably remember because you're old enough, called Coventry, which was the first of the British cities that was seriously blitzed. We got time sequence. We left Germany on a boat, on a train to Holland, to meet a boat at the Hook of Holland, which was the ferry terminal to London.
You were incredibly lucky because in '39 they
Right.
marched in Poland. It was already impossible for you to get out.
Well, we
you
left.
got out.
We left in May '39,
Oh,
and the
that
war
was in September. Yeah.
the war broke out in August, September. So we were lucky by 2 months. In any event, we made our way to London at Liverpool Street Station, where we came from the ferry boat to the London. That's the London train station. We were greeted by Bloomsbury House and by my mother's cousin, who, in the car taking us to his house temporarily, told my mom that he had gone bankrupt and couldn't afford her as a housemate. In fact, had to sell his house, but Goldie, he had arranged to get a job with some other family. Turned out with. Okay, so we started our life in England. Bloomsbury House. Mom was working for a family in London. We got shipped to Coventry. I was supposed to be taken in by a Jewish family, but they had already gotten 2 other refugee kids and said they couldn't take me. It was a family called Cohen. So I ended up with a British family called Shepherd, a rather, working class British family. My sister was fostered by a family called Simon, a Jewish family, Jewish merchant family, and that went okay. She was not well taken care of. She was, at the time I was 9, turning 10. She had just turned 11, and in effect they used her as a housemaid. The family I was with, who had 2 older children, took me in as just another child, and it was a fairly poor. He was a postman. She was a part-time barmaid, and I lived with them for 3 years. That was in middle '39. November 14th, the war broke out. November 14th, 1940 was the first major blitz. Coventry was the Detroit of England. It was the motor capital of England, and the Germans attacked it viciously. And I can remember we were out of, the school systems were closed, the sewage and the water systems were disabled, the factories were burning. Fortunately, the house that I was in, the Shepherd's house, was next door to the fire station. And the firemen let us sleep in their shelter. So I was okay. Unbeknownst to me, the Jewish community, which was in Coventry, which was a fairly well-to-do merchant community, as they always are. They were the general stores, they were the clothiers, etc., etc. They vanished. They had houses or summer places in the countryside, And that's where they went, and my sister went with them. And I didn't know that. Neither did my mother, who was in London, and you know, couldn't reach us for weeks. Didn't know what her children's condition was. So anyway, we survived that, and I survived it very well because this family treated me so well, and I made non-Jewish friends up the block and in school, and integrated into British society very, very quickly. I remember being extremely homesick the first, I don't know how long, maybe it was a week, maybe it was 10 days, maybe it was longer than that, but I do remember crying and not knowing why I was crying, but it was homesickness. And then I remember how hard they tried, this Shepherd family tried to teach me English. Because I didn't have a word of English, they didn't have a word of German. And I remember the first thing I learned in English was because I could by then read the time. And they had a clock over on the mantelpiece, over their fireplace. And the first words I learned was, "It's 10 minutes fast." They always kept the clock 10 minutes ahead. And I remember their daughter continually telling me, "It's 10 minutes fast." That's the first English that I learned. So, but then, you know, then I got along very well. What did happen because between middle 39 and 40, we had that 12, 13 months interval where they took me to the synagogue, so I attended Cheder 3 times a week, and they made sure that I went. The Jewish family could care less whether my sister went.
Wow.
But the non-Jewish family, they wanted me to keep my religion. So that, you know, so I learned a little bit.
Were you in contact with your mother?
Later I was. We were able to send a postcard. We didn't have phones. It was too early. There were phones, but the family I was with didn't have a phone. They were too poor. But they did have a phone on the corner, and if you had a few coins, you could call. So I think we did actually manage to get a phone call through, so she knew at least I was alive. I'm not sure when she found out that my sister was still alive, because my sister was in the countryside. So that was, you know, how it went. And then with this blitz, Cheder closed. So that's when I lost, that was the end of my Jewish education at 10. I was a little older, or 11 by then. No, I was 10 then. So, there's the blitz. For a 10, 11-year-old, no big deal. We didn't realize how serious it was. Nobody that I knew, none of my friends were injured or killed. The wartime austerity had already taken place. The British had a severe draft for all men. Up to, I think, into their 40s, they got drafted into the army. The rest of them, into their 50s and 60s, they got drafted into home defense. You know, as air raid wardens, as shelter managers, and all kinds of things. And very quickly rationing, severe rationing. But this family shared their what little they had with me. So I thrived in that environment because it was a nurturing environment. And I did well in school. And within weeks, I was fluent in English, which is, as a youngster, that's pretty easy. And for that reason, I don't have a lot, as an aside, I haven't a lot of sympathy for English as a second language in the Dallas or in any American school system, because kids adapt so quickly. If you keep them on their immigrant language, then it takes them so much longer to get fully integrated into, and many of them never do because they speak the native tongue at home, and they're always behind the eight ball. That's one of the problems in Canada, you know, the Quebecois,
Yeah.
they never did integrate. Anyway, so and I stayed there till I was 12, or not quite 12, and Mama began to worry about how am I going to learn for my bar mitzvah if there's no cheder. So she went back to Bloomsbury House, who arranged for me to live with the Jewish orphanage. It was a very fine Jewish orphanage, which was in a place called Norwood, which is a southern, near-in suburb of London, actually within London. It's a borough of London, which had been evacuated from London to a town called Hertford, 20, 30 miles north of London. And they were using an abandoned, an old schoolhouse for the schooling, but their children, the orphans, were all farmed out on families, non-Jewish families in Hertford, which is a fairly small town. It was a fairly small town at the time. It was a county seat of Hertfordshire, but a small town. And I went there and was fostered by a group of families. The first one took me in because they had a polio-stricken child who was a year younger than I, for whom they thought they needed a companion. And also because I had a ration card, it gave them an additional ration to share. But their child, their son, for whatever reason, didn't like me. And it may be, I don't know what it was anymore, it may be that he was worried that I would get some affection taken away from him by the parents. So I lasted there, just a couple of months. And they began to sort of wiggle, how could they get rid of me? And one of their neighbors, also in a rather poor neighborhood, said, I'll take him. And who took me? It was a woman called Hill, Mrs. Hill. I don't know anymore whether I even ever knew her first name. But she was home alone. Her husband was in the army in North Africa. I don't know if he ever came back. And I lived with her for a couple of months until one night, one night I was able to go, because it was very close to London, it was a short train ride. Went to London to see my mom for just one day or whatever. She couldn't keep me overnight. She put me back on the train to Hartford. I got there at night and the door was locked and I'm sitting out on the doorstep and she had a gentleman caller. Turned out she was a prostitute, which, you know, at my age I didn't even know what a prostitute was, but that's what she was. So her neighbors saw me sitting on the doorstep and said, come and live with me. And that was a family called Pettit, and they were the salt of the earth. I was with them for the next 3 years. They had a little son. I became his babysitter. They took care of me. I took care of them. I learned how to darn socks. He was asthmatic, so he was not in the army. He was a greengrocer's helper. She worked part-time as a greengrocer's helper and part-time taking care of an invalid brother and her mother who lived down the street, and she had this little boy. So I, fell into this family, and they were just wonderful, wonderful. And we stayed in touch with her until 5 years ago when she died. And with her, and she fostered me and adopted me, and at the same time fostered another kid. So she had her own little child, me, and another refugee type kid. And after we left, she adopted 3 more boys.
Oh.
This woman was just the salt of the earth. So, but that was a happy experience for me. And then at the orphanage, I also did well and got very, very lucky scholastically. I learned my bar mitzvah. And since it was a London County school, in England, at the time they had a system of scholarships to what they called grammar schools, which were like poor man's Eton or Harrow. Very upgraded schools, because the school system at the time was only mandatory till 14 in the regular British kid, unless he had a lot of money or unless he was extremely lucky. At 14, out and in the workforce, which in those days was very necessary because the men were at war. Who's going to run the rest of the economy? So at 12 and a half, I took a London County Council scholarship exam and was the second kid in the orphanage that ever got one.
Ah.
So I was admitted to Battersea Grammar School, which was a grammar school from London, a higher education school that was evacuated to Hartford, to the same community, and shared the Hartford Grammar School's grounds. So I enrolled there. And that's where I got a sterling, pardon the pun, education, because this was a very rigorous education. At 13, I was taking in the same 1 week, or in the same semester, or the same year, French, Latin, German, 3 maths. So I took, by the time I was 13, I had taken, or I was taking, algebra, geometry, and trig, English history, English literature, chemistry, and physics. Okay?
Okay.
Not 5 days a week like you do here. 2 hours or 3 hours a week. The school day was from 8:30 till 5:30. Half day was for sports, and the rest was class after class after class. Anyway, I thrived.
Any anti-Semitism?
A touch. I can remember one incident, but not really very much. No. The British were good to us. They saved our lives. But I got, so that lasted until 45, and because by then one of my mother's siblings, her older sister, had come to the States in 37. They lived in New York. They weren't well-to-do, but they were okay, and established visas for us, and we got visa permission to come to the U.S. I remember we had to go to London to get examined at somewhere on Grosvenor Square, where an army physician, a captain, examined us because the Americans didn't want somebody with tuberculosis or disease-ridden to come in, so that we had to go for exams, and we passed. And in April 45, the week before Roosevelt died, we arrived in New York via Halifax. We were on a British liner, which was served as a Canadian troop ship. Bloomsbury House arranged the passage. Bloomsbury House paid for the passage because we didn't have any money. And we arrived, they reserved 2 cabins, I remember, one for men, one for women. So a group of maybe 30 or 40 refugees left Greenock, which was the Scottish port for Glasgow, on this troop ship which was bringing Canadian troops back from the European theater, many of them wounded. And we had cabins on that ship.
Your mother, your sister?
Yeah, we came together. Mm-hmm. We came together. Which was the first time we were reunited as a family. And that was April 45. And by the time we got to New York, we went from Halifax by train to Montreal. In Montreal, we were met by Hadassah or whatever, some Jewish women's group met the train. They knew we were coming. They had bananas, and we hadn't seen bananas since before the war. So my sister and I gorged on bananas in Montreal, and then they put us on a changed trains from Montreal to New York. We got to New York, I think it was like 2 days before Roosevelt died. And our aunt picked us up at Penn Station, and we lived with her for a few months in Jamaica, New York. And then my mom got a job as a sewing machine operator in the garment center. My sister went to night school and got a day job as an assistant to a dentist. And I went to high school. I went and got into middle of sophomore year high school in New York. And because I had this fantastic background in England, in some subjects I was just miles ahead. And in some subjects like Spanish or American history, I was way back there, but I did very well in high school. So that was 45. Sister managed to complete high school and then went to full-time dental work. And I finished high school in 48. Mama became a forelady in the raincoat factory where she worked. And we got our own little apartment. And we lived quite nicely. My sister then, in 49, met her then, what was to be her husband. He had come back from, he had been in the service. He was also a German Jewish refugee. His family lived in uptown New York in Washington Heights. You may know about that. And they courted and they got married at the end of 49. She moved out. They moved to a little apartment. My mother and I had our own apartment. And then Mama got sick. So, 48, I graduated from high school, started Queens College. Through high school and through college, all that time I had part-time jobs. I was always working, but when Mama got sick, I had to leave. Leave college after a year and switch to night school because I had to find a job. And then, let's see what happened. And that went okay. Mama got better, I went back to college, took a night job, and then the Korean War broke out. By then I'd had about a year and a half because my college had been interrupted. And I was in college, and I got college deferred like they do here, if you stay full-time in college. Well, that worked all right until Mama got sick again. So I had to go leave day school, go to night school. Draft board heard about it. You're no longer a full-time student. You're coming into the Army. Because then, at that time, they were drafting 50,000 kids a year, a month.
I remember.
And they desperately needed bodies. So I said, I have to stay home, I have to take care of my mom. Well, that worked for a couple of months. And then they said, the Army will give you dependent pay, you're in. So in 51, I got drafted. And in retrospect, that's, except for meeting my wife later on, that's probably the best thing that happened to me. Because when I got out of the Army, I had the GI Bill.
Got an education.
Huh?
You got an education.
So that's how it went. And it went fine. We never had a pit to hiss in. But we never felt poor. We just never did. We never missed a meal. We worked. I can remember one summer I had 3 jobs. I was a busboy. I was a busboy. Let's see. I was a busboy in the Empire State Building, where they had, on the 21st floor, they had a luncheon club, a very exclusive club. So I worked there from 11 to 2 as a busboy. And I was one of the few English-speaking busboys. Most of them were Puerto Rican kids. So I didn't have to work in the main dining room with the heavy trays. They put me in the bar, where I just cleaned up glasses and cut off the Wall Street ticker and such. So that was a day job, 5 days a week, because it was a business luncheon club. And in the afternoon, I would walk over to the garment center. I became a shipping clerk's helper. I was a wheeler boy in the garment center 5 days a week. And on weekends, I was a busboy, Saturdays and Sundays, in the Piccadilly Hotel. So I had 3 jobs. And I kept 2 of them when I went to school later on, because I went to day school, and I kept the afternoon, evening job as packing packages and taking them to the post office. And the weekend I would be a busboy.
Did you go straight from New York to Dallas?
No.
Or what got you to Dallas?
Well, okay. Here's what got me to Dallas. I'm backtracking a little bit.
All right.
And this is a really good story. When I was in the Army, I got shipped to Korea. This is another crazy sort of things that happened to people. I was fluent in German, okay? I got drafted and did very well in basic training, and they give you IQ tests, and I guess they don't get a lot of very high IQs or whatever it was. But toward the end of basic training, by the way, we lived in New York, and I got shipped to Breckenridge, Kentucky for basic training, which for a kid who had never been west of the Hudson River, it was like Hubbardsville, you know, Western Kentucky. Anyway, so I was, with all these kids from the farms in Kentucky and in Indiana and Illinois and you name it, and here's this Jewish kid from New York who had a good score on IQ tests. And we had I guess, I'm not quite sure how that worked anymore, but we had a World War II reservist captain who they called back in during Korea, and he became a training officer in the regiment that I was training in, or the battalion. They evidently had some kind of quota for officers' training school. So he wanted me to enroll in officers' training school because I had the IQ that matched what they needed. And I said, I can't, because I'm not a U.S. citizen yet. And you can't become an officer unless you're a citizen. He said, well, how long have you been here? And I said, well, right then, we got notice that our citizenship papers were available at the courthouse in Brooklyn, because it had been 5 years and some odd since we'd applied. So I said, I'd have to go to New York and get my citizenship papers. He said, I'll give you a 5-day pass. You can go get your citizenship, come back and enroll. So I took this 5-day pass, made my way up to New York, discussed this with Mama. And Mama didn't think it was a good idea to become an officer, because it would mean being in the Army longer. She had this bitter memory of her officer husband who died early because of a wound. She didn't say that, but I'm sure that influenced it. And she said she didn't think I should do that. So I got my citizenship papers, and I probably can show it to you. And I went back to Breckenridge, to my training unit, and I didn't enroll for officers candidate school. So what happened? Although I speak German, I was on the next boat to Korea, where some of the hillbillies in my outfit got shipped to Fort Ord for language school to learn German, because they had a huge garrison still in Europe. So I got to Korea. So this was, and I got to Korea I ended up in the 45th Infantry Division, Signal Company, and I had another sterling career. I got there as a private. I got there as a private in, I think, oh yeah, I shipped out on my birthday. I got there in August. I shipped out in July, got to the 45th Infantry Division in Korea as a replacement for people who were coming home by then in '52. And between August of '52 and March or April of '53, I got only 10 more.
No, 20.
I got
20.
Yeah,
I got
that's what it's
5 stripes. I was a first sergeant in the signal company in the infantry, so I had a great Army career. And when I came home, which was in November '53, I thought, I had some college education, probably a year and a half, 2 years, from Queens College, nondescript, liberal arts, whatever it was. But I had this great Army career. The world is waiting for me. They weren't waiting for me. I couldn't get a job. I couldn't, it was after Korea, things had slowed down. I could have gotten an errand boy's job or a mail clerk somewhere in advertising agency or wherever. And if somebody likes you, you'll get a head kid, that kind of thing. And then I don't know, let's see how this went. That was at the end of '53, so I got a job as a floor walker in a department store, of course, for Christmas season, and began to think that I should go back to school and take my GI Bill. And I was going around New York, friends of ours who had sent me care packages in New York, and I remember visiting Aunt Selma in Washington Heights, who'd sent me beautiful salamis to Korea to thank her. And her brother-in-law, I was at Tanta Selma's in Washington Heights, and her brother-in-law was visiting her. Who was her brother-in-law? It was a guy called Harry Schoenfeld, who was an ex-German scrap dealer that Jake Feldman had hired, was working in Jake's yard in Fort Worth. And Jake had shipped some stuff to Germany that was a problem of one kind or another. And the Germans had asked for somebody to come over and look at it. So Jake sent Harry Schoenfeld from Fort Worth to Germany. But Harry didn't fly. So he took the train to New York, and he was staying with his sister-in-law in Washington Heights, waiting for the boat from New York to Hamburg. And here I show up. And he said, "Kid, what are you going to do?" I said, "I'm looking for work." He said, "Write to Jake Feldman. Here's the address." There's the answer. So it was a don't call, the answer from Jake was, "Don't call us, we'll call you." So with that and a whole bunch of other sorry kids, I took an entrance exam to engineering school at City College, and I passed. I don't know how I passed, because I was competing with, you know, I'd been out of school already for some time, out of the Army, and I'm competing with the cream of New York's high schools. Brooklyn Tech, Stuyvesant, you know, all these brilliant kids. They must have taken notice that I was a veteran, so they admitted me to engineering school. So I started at City College Engineering School during the day, floor walker at Gertz in the department store at night, and that went on for 2 years. And in the interim, Jake's brother-in-law, who had an office in New York, his sister was Bessie Nathan. Bessie's husband dropped dead on the street in Italy on a business trip, and Jake became the executor of his estate, Richard Nathan's estate. And Richard had a beautiful office in downtown New York. And Jake had to dismantle that office. So he kept one corner of it, and one of Richard Nathan's key employees, and sent an employee from Dallas to New York, so 2 of them, to open a trading office for Commercial Metals in New York. And they needed a gopher. They needed somebody to run errands. And they called me. That was 2 years later. So I said, "What do you mean? You know, if I wait for you, I would have starved." So they called me and they said, "Well, why don't you come down and talk to us?" And it turned out it was another one of the periods where Mama got sick. And I couldn't, coincidentally, I just would have had to switch again to night school and get a day job. And here was a day job.
The shirt.
Yeah, so I went to work for them for $1.25 an hour for a trial period.
As a gopher.
As a gopher, teletype, running errands, delivering checks, opening the mail, and all that. As a trainee gopher. And I finished the semester, so between Christmas and New Year's, I went to work for 1945. And I worked for Commercial Metals till the year 2000. And nobody ever told me that I was no longer on a trial period, you know?
Wait, in 45, you mean 55?
55,
Yeah,
excuse me.
okay.
Yeah, so I was with Commercial for just about 45 years. So that was...
So did you bring your mom with you to Dallas?
No, that was 55, and that was winter 55. Winter 56. No, it was still winter 50, it was early 56. I met Terry.
Where?
We were blind dated. We were blind dated by my mom, my sister, and Terry's aunt, a woman who had married Terry's uncle, who was also a German refugee, who came from Eschwege, this town that we moved to. And my mom was very friendly with her parents and with her. And they found each other again in New York. Anyway, Joan, she used to be Irmgard Kahn, she changed it to Joan Carey when we met her. But she later on, or little while after that, married Terry's uncle. And while I was in Korea, they had their 5th wedding anniversary, this Joan and Terry's uncle. And Terry's parents lent them their house to have a 5th anniversary party. And my sister, well, this was while I was in Korea, my sister and my mom got invited, and they met Terry. And they all, I guess, agreed that wouldn't this be a nice young lady when Bert gets home? So I got home in '53, and in early '56 they finally managed to sneak her phone number to me or whatever it was. And I can remember in January or February of '56, I called on Terry at their house in Hewlett, New York, which is the next neighboring suburb. And there she was in all her glory. I can still remember the dress that she was wearing, a silver lame dress. She was gorgeous. And I was driving a car that I'd bought for $200 from our across the street neighbor in New York. This is a car that had been on the, there had no garages and all. It had been sitting outside all its life. And they were ready to get rid of it, and I paid $200 for it with my mustering out pay. And I can remember, I picked up Terry. It was a rainy, misty, foggy night, and by then I was working for Commercial Metals Company, so I had a little money in my pocket. First time I ever made any money with some change. And we went out to a restaurant called the Barefoot Boy of Brittany Hills. It was some guy in Michigas. And I remember it was raining and we were driving on the Cross Island Parkway. And this was the time of the high heels, spike heels. Terry got in the car and she put her heel right through the floorboard. It was rusted out, and the rain was splashing up on her stockings. That was our introduction.
Oh, God.
That was in early '56.
Did you know it was it as soon as you met?
I don't know. We dated pretty frequently then, and we got engaged toward the end of '56, and we got married in '57. So that's how I met Terry. They were bound and determined that, they plotted this thing 3 or 4 years before we ever met. But they were persistent.
And it worked.
I didn't really. I should have known that I didn't have a choice. Anyway, we got married in '57. By then I had been working for Commercial for a year already, a little more, year and a half. And was going to night school because I hadn't finished when they hired me. I had been in engineering school for 2 years. I would have had another year to go, but I had to switch to night school, which ended up taking me almost 2 years. And during that time I met Terry. I was still going to night school. And then Commercial had bought another little scrap operation in Philadelphia where they needed an assistant foreman, and we got married in '57. In summer of '58 I finally finished my last engineering course in second summer session night school.
And this was at NY?
This was at City College.
City College.
As soon as I finished that, bingo, they transferred me to Philadelphia. We moved to Philadelphia. We were there for 2 years. And then
so it's 59 by now.
Yeah, well, it was August '58. And then in '60 they had an opening here, and I'll tell you about that later. That's when I moved to Dallas.
58.
No, 60.
60. Yes. What? And you're 28.
No, I'm 30.
You're 30? Okay, you're 30. Your wife, Terry Romberg, is formerly, what was her name?
Therese Klinger, Terry Klinger.
Klinger?
Klinger.
Klinger, okay. Therese Klinger. And you're 30, she's 20.
She was 5 years younger. She was 25.
She's 25.
Okay.
And where do you settle in Dallas?
Well, we came down in March 30th, 1960. Terry, by then, we had been married since 57. Terry was 7 months pregnant with our first child. We landed. It was a foggy, misty, rainy night in Dallas. Commercial Metals had ordered us to come down here. We flew into Love Field, got a taxi to the Adolphus Hotel. They got us a room in the old section of the Adolphus, which was pretty run down, with a bare light bulb and so on. And Terry, we got in there late at night. It was 10:30, and she broke down and cried.
Well, she should have been used to that since her foot went through your car.
Well, no. Anyway, and Commercial Metals had its office on Ackert Street, right down where City Hall is now. Mm-hmm. So that's why they put us into the office. It was close by. So they stayed there, and then we got an apartment on Del Norte Lane.
Oh, sure.
Right across the way from the temple. Mm-hmm. And the reason we got there, because my new boss, Walter Florsheim, who was manager of about a half of Commercial, he was one of their major sales. He was their major non-ferrous salesperson, and I came down to train under him. And his wife insisted that we get a place near where they lived, so that Walter could bring me in the morning, and Terry could keep the little car we were shipping down from Philadelphia. So we stayed on Del Norte Lane for a year and a half in one of those apartments on the corner there. They're still there, by the way.
Those were duplexes too.
They were right, and then we bought a little house in northwest Dallas on Webb Chapel Road, in that neighborhood. We lived there. Well, our first child was born in May 1960. Our second child was born in April 1962. By then we were already living in our own little house. And our third child was born in April 1964. Three girls.
Okay, their names?
Paula, Leah, and Hannah. So that's, and then that was 64. In 67,
What was your title at Commercial Metals at that time?
I didn't have a title when they brought me down here. I came down to understudy the manager of what they call the metal department.
Okay.
Which was, the company was divided into two divisions. One was steel and one was metal, all the other metals. And Walter Florsheim was in charge of the metal department. I came down to understudy him because he was a pretty independent soul. He was also a German refugee who'd been working for Jake since 1936 and was sharing managerial responsibilities over some of the yards with Bernie Shanin. Do you remember Bernie Shanin?
Sure.
And Jake reorganized the company, brought Walter into the main office, left Bernie to manage the yard, and but Walter was a pretty independent soul and had gotten fairly wealthy because Jake paid very well, and had had many knockdown, drag-out disagreements and fights with Jake. And I think Jake was concerned that Walter might just walk out one of these days, so he better get somebody down here to train under him. So they called me down from Philadelphia. So I trained under Walter. I was beginning 60, and in 61, end of 61, Walter was not really an old man, but he was getting on in years, had a serious heart attack. And heart attacks in those days, I guess, were not treated quite the way they were. Anyway, he was under an oxygen tent for I don't know how long, and finally came back to work, but then he decided to retire. And I sort of fell into that job in 62, end of 62, with really not a lot of experience. So Jake took over. He began to train me around the clock, and he was merciless. Did you know Jake, or you knew him?
Not personally.
Well, Feldman had unbelievable energy, an unbelievable intellect, and unbelievable tenacity, and he had the ability to take anything he worked on all the way to its logical or illogical conclusion, many times illogical, but he wouldn't let loose until, and that drove us wild, because we just had to work around, and we did work around the clock, and he would insist. His training of me was to literally dot my T's, cross my I's, and watched everything I did for about 2 years, around the clock. And then he finally let me loose. He finally gave me a title of vice president, and I became the non-ferrous marketing manager for the company, and did very well. I mean, I think I did very well by the company, but they did very well by me. And we grew, and we grew, and we grew. When I went to work for the company, when they hired me in New York, we probably had 250 employees in scrap yards in Fort Worth, in Dallas, and in Houston. I believe that's all we had, and an office here. When I left the company in 2000, we had 12,000 employees.
All in the Texas, Fort Worth, Houston area?
By then we had scrap yards from California to Florida. The furthest north we ever got was Springfield, Ohio. We never got into Chicago or New York, but we did get to Philadelphia, except that was where I worked for a while, but then we closed that down. I was responsible for closing it down because it was just not feasible anymore. But
Saul Kaplan was your era, wasn't it?
yeah, Saul Kaplan was in our area. Saul was in the paper and rag business, a very good friend of ours. And so was Saul Levine. Do you remember Saul Levine?
Yeah.
And the Ocons. Do you remember the Ocon family?
Yes. Yep.
Those were all the people around here. Well, anyway, I didn't, my particular job didn't keep me very busy in the local market, in the Texas market. My nearest client was in St. Louis. So I grew, my responsibility for the company was to take our materials globally. So I eventually began working in Japan. I opened markets for the company in Korea, in Taiwan, Hong Kong, India. Did a huge amount of business in Germany, which had started before, but I carried it on. But I never went back to Germany. I always found somebody to send, or they would come to see us. And then eventually we opened our own office in Amsterdam, in Brussels, in Switzerland, over the years. But that's a much broader story. I can, if you want that story, I can give it to you, but I think it would take much longer than that. So anyway, that was my career there was fascinating. We were, Terry and I, and many times Terry would come along. Our kids grew up thinking, living, breathing commercial metals company.
I'm interested and curious to know about your Jewish affiliations.
Okay, because in New York, Terry came from a very reformed background. So reformed that I don't think her daddy was in the synagogue from Terry's bas mitzvah till his grandchild's bas mitzvah.
But she had a bas mitzvah.
Yeah, of sorts, a confirmation, I think it was.
Oh,
It wasn't really a bas mitzvah. And I don't think it had anything to do with the rabbi, except for the guy that married Terry and I, who was not his rabbi. They didn't belong to a shul. He was the rabbi of Terry's mom's sister. She and her husband had a home in Scarsdale, New York, and we were married in their backyard by their rabbi. Our Jewish affiliation, my mom, my sister, and I in New York, we attended at first Jamaica Jewish Center, which was conservative, and later on a place called Hollis Hill Jewish Center, where we had our little apartment, or in the neighborhood where we had our little apartment. My friends in New York my close friends were Jewish, but I had a lot of non-Jewish friends, particularly non-Jewish girlfriends. Don't tell Terry. At Jamaica High School, but our college friends were mostly Jewish, many of whom I'm still in touch with, many of whom Terry became very friendly with. Grew up with a group of Jewish guys, many of them about a year and a half younger than I, and then a couple my age. We would, Sunday mornings hang around the basketball court, and then when we got hungry, we'd go to Slotkin's for nickels worth of rye bread and a toothpick.
In Dallas.
In Dallas, in Philadelphia, we became Jewish again. For the 2 years we lived in Philadelphia, we got an apartment where our next door neighbor was a very nice Jewish couple with 3 boys, and they introduced us, and they took us to Temple Sinai, where the famous Rabbi Greenberg took us under his wing. Sidney Greenberg, and we became Jewish again. That was conservative. And we are still in touch with some of those people. And here we joined because of the Feldmans. We joined Sheriff.
Sure.
And became very active in church. Terry became very active in sisterhood. In the late 60s, I was president of Brotherhood. So we were active in Sheriff for a long, long time. And we haven't been recently.
Are you still there?
Yeah. My sister is very active. She and her husband have been very good congregants there.
And your sister's name is?
First, F-U-R-S-T, Margaret First.
Margaret First.
Her husband
I know
died.
that name.
Harry, her husband died, I think 5 years ago now. She's exactly a year older than I am. We came here in 60, they followed us here in 63 and brought my mother with them. And that was, she lived until 74, and I have to, we reminisce about that. Those 10 years that she lived here were probably the best years of her life. She saw all her grandchildren. She had some independence. We took care of her. For the first time she ever had her own checking account. We forced her to have a credit card. She had her own little apartment. She was in the senior citizens group at JCC. She thrived there. She was grandmother or mother of the year there one time. And then, as she got older, her handwriting got worse, and her English was never that good, although it wasn't bad. But they made her recording secretary of the Senior Citizens Club. So that was a good time for her, and it was a gratifying time for us, because she had some peace and some independence.
You're kind of famous in my part of the world, and one of the reasons is your work with UTD on the Holocaust studies. Tell us about that, because it's so important.
That's only a sort of a recent thing. I'm very friendly with Sally Belovsky, who I think is one of the great community people in Dallas. Do you know?
Oh,
You
yeah.
should.
Yeah, and we need to interview him.
He is just an unbelievable,
It's
talented
incredible, yeah.
guy. Has done a tremendous amount of good in lots of places, so it was through him that I got introduced to UTD, and what appealed to me at UTD was that it is an effort at a very high level to teach the Holocaust story. And it's very well supported by the provost and the president of UTD. And what it does, it teaches tolerance. It teaches it from a different angle than the Holocaust Museum. It asks the question, how can what was at the time the most civilized Western country develop the most horrific event in Western culture, which was the Holocaust? And so it teaches about that Western culture, the German culture, the Austrian culture, the anti-Semitic core of those cultures, and then says, look what can happen. Which I think the Downtown Holocaust Museum also does, but not at that level. And at that level, they teach the next generation of professors, of college instructors, of high school instructors. And I think that is a much more, not much more, but I think that is a powerful, powerful teaching tool that needs support. So that's where Terry and I have decided, because you can't, when you are philanthropically minded and you're able to do things, and you have the time, you have the intellect, and you're lucky enough to have some discretionary spending, which not everybody is, but we've been able to, then you realize that you can't do everything, because there's just a limit. So you begin to zero in on what seems to you to be the most important. And we, in the last several years, have decided that's important. Not that the others aren't.
Yeah,
but
you can only focus in on so much.
But we zeroed in on that. In the past, I spent a lot of my time on Federation. I think for many years I was one of the premier, or the more effective or more important fundraisers for Federation. I chaired the campaign for 2 years. I chaired the pace setters for 2 years. Then I finally said, that's enough. No more chairmanships, no more committee, but I'll be an Indian. So as an Indian, I took 30, 40 cards a year and solicited them. So I haven't done that for the last couple of years. I think those two items have been our major contributions to the Dallas community, the Jewish community in particular, the Dallas community in general. And then we have a little pet project up in Wyoming where we found that in Jacksonville, Wyoming, there are Jews. And many of them don't want to be Jews. Many of them don't say, "Hineni, here I am." But there are Jews and they have children. And when we were up there, when we first sort of were regular visitors up there, and then when we decided to build a house there, we saw that there were families that have Jewish kids and they didn't know what to do with them. And one of the reasons they didn't know is because there's so many intermarrieds. So we planted the seed that maybe we kickstart a little bit of Jewish education, and we said, why, if you would want to, we don't want to tell you what to do, but if you want to, and you think you can develop a little summer day camp program, we'll sponsor it. So that started 14 years ago.
Is there a center for the day camp?
No. They rent facilities, and we have an ongoing summer day camp for 25 to 35 kids from 5 or 6 to bar mitzvah age. And we've basically underwritten that, for the last 13, 14 years. I'll tell you, it's very difficult in that community, in a community like that, to give the kids something to hold on to, some Jewish education. So.
But you're doing it.
We're doing it, and we've had bar mitzvahs, and we've had bat mitzvahs, and we've had weddings, so they make, in this little day camp, they make challah on Friday evenings, and they sing smears and songs, and we get little Jewish-style postcards from them.
Well, Bert, you've really led a fascinating life, from soup to some
Gotta do
soup
something.
to nuts, and you're really one of the more interesting people.
When
Not the most
we got to New York in '45, we had 2 cardboard suitcases of old clothes and $13. That's what we started with. So Mama went to work as a sewing machine operator. Sister went to work for the dentist, and I remember I went to, my first job was as a stock boy in Miles Shoe Store. And I can remember, well, you guys have been to New York, so you know what Times Square is like.
Oh, yes.
Well, on the corner of 45th and Broadway was a Niedix Frankfurter store. You remember Niedix?
Oh, yeah, I do.
And they had, and this is when we had just come from Europe, where there was severe rationing. And I was a busboy in the Piccadilly Hotel. And on the way out, on the way home, 10 o'clock in the evening, on the way to the subway, I would pass the Niedix, and the hot dogs would be on the grill, and a hot dog was a dime, and a papaya juice was a nickel. And I treated myself to a papaya juice and a hot dog. It was glorious. And then later on, let me finish with this one story. When I was working as the shipping clerk's assistant, packing packages and taking them to the post office and such, when we had a holiday, I would work a whole day instead of in the afternoons only, and then my aunt would pack me, or my mom would pack me a sandwich in cellophane paper, and I would have to bring the cellophane paper home at night. But every once in a while I would get terribly hungry, a 15-year-old kid, 14-year-old kid. And downstairs in the freight elevator, there was a little, like a delicatessen stand. And this guy made corned beef sandwiches. And a corned beef sandwich cost 40 cents. And I was making 35 cents an hour. But I had to have one. So I would once in a while, for a whole hour's work, one sandwich. For the 15-year-old kid, one sandwich is not enough. You know? So, but I had to make it do. So I would eat half now and go back to work, and then take a break 3 hours later, and eat the other half of the sandwich.
So you'd bring home to mother 15 cents.
So, anyway. Okay. Thank you, ladies.
Oh,
Thank you so
much.
much. It's been a wonderful.